If you realize that the human being is hardwired to respond emotionally to stories, you can now understand why applying stories to things is so important. So if you have a widget that comes out of a widget machine, and here's another widget from another widget machine, if I can tell you a story about this one that separates this one from that one, I can actually get you to feel differently. And feeling is what we're after. Very often, luxury objects are objects that are only separated because of the way they're able to make us feel, oh, now I've got it. Got what? Got overpriced water? Got an overpriced car? You put the logic machine on top of it, it makes no sense. But you put the emotional machine next to it, you can see what's happening.
That it's not, you think you need a new piece of clothing, but you'll feel better with the piece of clothing.
The bigger the stores, the bigger the shopping malls, the more we find that people buy on impulse. They don't go in maybe with a few things that they want to get, but they come home with a whole lot more because they see literally so much stuff. And as a result, I think it's led to a real epidemic of debt, too, in the country. After World War II, since World War II, the United States has really been obsessed with producing and consuming as the primary value. So that to talk about reducing working hours really dropped out of the picture virtually completely. The idea of that we could use our productivity to give us more leisure, to give us more time for other values, family, community, civic participation, all those kind of things. That got dropped from the picture after World War II.
The more that people are exposed to messages in their social environment which seem to suggest that materialistic values are important to them, the more they themselves also endorse materialistic values. So we know from several studies that the more materialistic parents are, the more materialistic kids are. We know that mostly with mothers, actually. There's not a lot of data with fathers, but mostly with mothers. We know that the more television that children are exposed to, the more materialistic they are. And of course, television is one of the major sources of materialistic messages. We know that materialistic peers, there's just a little bit of data starting to suggest that the more you have materialistic peers, the more materialistic you yourselves are too. So there's this set of social models which seem to create this desire to have what other people seem to be saying are important. So that's the first set of influences. The second set of influences are what we call psychological insecurity. One of the things we know from the research is that when people are put in situations which make them feel psychologically insecure, they tend to orient towards materialistic values. So, for example, when research studies show that when kids are raised by parents who are more cold and controlling and non-nurturant, they tend to be more materialistic. We know that when kids grow up and their parents get divorced, the kids tend to be more materialistic. We know that growing up in economic insecurity, which of course makes people feel pretty insecure, that those kids are actually more materialistic than kids who have more stability economically.
The human body was designed for acute emergencies, but when the acute emergency is continuous, when the alarm bells are ringing all the time, it never relaxes. And the results of that are people get all sorts of stress diseases. Anxiety is just the beginning. Depression, they get depression because they feel they can't cope. They get other somatic diseases like hypertension, cardiovascular disease. So one of the most obvious results of this fast-paced world is that we tend to reduce the time we spend in social interaction around very important functions, such as eating, for example. And we spend much less time now eating around a table than we do driving around in a car together.
The more that my subjects were reporting that they thought it was very important to make a lot of money and have a lot of possessions, actually the less happy they were. They were reporting more depression, more anxiety, less feelings of vitality and aliveness and such like that. The more that I began to think about it and understand this finding that materialism was bad for people's well-being, the more it struck me as very interesting given the society that we live in, which continually tells us that the way to happiness is to make a lot of money and have a lot of possessions.
The notion of kind of animal drives, unconscious instinctual drives lurking beneath the surface of civilization. And so they started looking towards psychological science as a way of understanding the mechanisms by which the popular mind works, specifically with the goal of figuring out how to understand how to apply those mechanisms to strategies for social control.
If you activate in people's minds those materialistic values, what you see is a suppression of the intrinsic values. Conversely, to the extent that you can promote those intrinsic values, what you start to see is a suppression of the materialistic values. And this makes perfect sense when you think about it. You can either be greedy or you can be generous. It's tough to be them both at the same moment, right? Okay? If you can promote the generosity, you're going to suppress the greed. If you promote the greed, you're going to suppress the generosity. So from my viewpoint, what we need really, and what's best for being a human, is to live in environments where those intrinsic values are promoted and encouraged and made able to be enacted. And then what you can start to have is people focusing on those intrinsic values, and sort of almost by necessity with the way that the mind is structured, you'll start to see less and less focus on those materialistic values.